What if Mark actually won that fight back in Season 1? Not barely survived, not got broken and left in the dirt, but straight up defeated Omni-Man, his own father, the strongest man on Earth at that point, and ended the invasion before it even started. Because that single moment flips the entire Invincible timeline on its head, and it starts with one key change. Mark doesn't hesitate. He doesn't freeze when Nolan starts talking about Viltrumite superiority. He doesn't get emotionally overwhelmed. Instead, he locks in. He realizes this is not a debate. This is survival. And the fight plays out differently from the first punch. Mark fights smarter. He keeps distance early. He uses the environment more, smashing Nolan through buildings but not letting himself get grabbed. Because every time Nolan closes distance in the original fight, Mark gets overwhelmed. So here, Mark adapts fast. He keeps moving, high speed, unpredictable angles, forcing Nolan to react instead of dominate. And that alone shifts the rhythm. Because Omni-Man is used to controlling fights, he expects Mark to panic, to get emotional. But instead, Mark stays sharp. He targets weak points, eyes, ears, joints, places Nolan doesn't expect his son to even think about. And while it doesn't cripple Nolan immediately, it slows him down. And that's all Mark needs. Because this version of Mark doesn't fight like a son trying to reach his father. He fights like someone who already accepted that Nolan is gone. And that mental shift is everything. So when Nolan starts his speech about Viltrum, about how Earth is nothing, Mark doesn't break. He interrupts him mid-sentence with a full-force hit that actually rattles Nolan. And that's the first time we see something new. Omni-Man is surprised. Not because Mark is stronger, but because Mark is fighting with intent to win, not survive. And as the fight escalates, Mark starts landing cleaner hits, not stronger hits, but better placed ones. He uses momentum. He redirects Nolan's own attacks, smashing him into the ground harder than Nolan expected. And over time, that damage stacks, because even Viltrumites feel cumulative damage, and Nolan starts realizing something is wrong. This isn't going like he predicted. Mark isn't folding. He's evolving mid-fight, adapting faster than Nolan can adjust. And then we hit the turning point. The train scene never happens, because Mark never gets pinned long enough for Nolan to drag him through civilians. Instead, Mark counters a grab attempt, flips Nolan's trajectory, and launches him upward into the sky, taking the fight away from populated areas entirely. And that matters, because Nolan's biggest psychological weapon was forcing Mark to watch humans die. But without that, Nolan loses leverage. Now it's just raw combat. And in that space, Mark starts to edge out small advantages, and then comes the moment that decides everything. Nolan goes all out, full-speed blitz, trying to end it instantly. But Mark predicts it. He's been reading Nolan's patterns the entire fight, and he counters with everything he has. A direct collision, full force, no holding back, and for the first time, Nolan takes real damage, enough to stagger him, enough to create an opening. And Mark doesn't hesitate. He follows up, relentless, hit after hit, not giving Nolan time to recover. And eventually, Nolan goes down, not dead, but defeated, broken, forced into the ground, unable to continue. And that's the moment that changes the world. Because Mark stands there, breathing heavy, looking at his father, and instead of begging him to stop, he tells him it's over. And that victory sends shockwaves across the entire planet. Cecil gets involved immediately. The government steps in, Omni-Man is contained, not killed, because he's too valuable, too dangerous. But now he's a prisoner, and Earth learns the truth about Viltrum much earlier, which accelerates everything. Mark becomes the strongest defender of Earth overnight, but he also becomes a target, because the Viltrum Empire doesn't ignore failures, they investigate them. And Nolan's defeat triggers attention way earlier than in the original timeline. So instead of years of build-up, Mark gets months at best before bigger threats arrive. And mentally, this version of Mark is different. He's not the same broken kid trying to process trauma. He's someone who crossed a line early. He beat his own father in a fight to the death, and that hardens him, not completely, but enough to change his decisions going forward. He trains harder, he listens to Cecil more, but he also questions him more, because now Mark knows what real threats look like, and he doesn't trust systems to handle them. And when characters like the Alan the Alien show up, Mark is more direct, more serious. He doesn't treat it like a casual encounter. He pushes for information, for alliances, faster, because he understands the scale of what's coming. And this leads to something huge. Earth becomes militarized earlier. Cecil invests more into anti-Viltrumite weapons, into contingency plans, into training Mark as a frontline asset, not just a hero. And that changes the tone of the entire story. Because now it's less about Mark growing into his role, and more about Mark being forced into leadership early. And when the Viltrumites finally arrive, they're not walking into a naive planet. They're walking into a prepared one. But that doesn't mean Earth wins easily, because Viltrumites are still overwhelming. But Mark's early victory gives humanity a fighting chance they never had before. And then there's Nolan, still alive, still imprisoned. And that dynamic becomes one of the most important parts of this timeline. Because instead of leaving Earth and later redeeming himself, Nolan is forced to sit and watch. to see the consequences of his actions unfold in real time, to see Mark become the very thing he tried to shape him into, but in a completely different way. And over time, that breaks Nolan in a different sense, not physically, but mentally, because he starts to question everything, his mission, his loyalty to Viltrum, his relationship with Mark, and that opens the door for a different kind of redemption arc, one that happens on Earth, under watch, under pressure, and possibly even earlier. And if Nolan eventually switches sides again, this time it's not from distance, it's from proximity, from seeing humanity up close after losing to it. And that could create a stronger alliance later, when the Viltrum War fully kicks off. But the biggest change still comes down to Mark himself, because winning that early fight changes how everyone sees him. Heroes respect him more, villains fear him more, and the world depends on him more. And that pressure builds fast, because he doesn't get the slow growth period he had before. He's thrown into the deep end immediately, dealing with threats that escalate quicker than he's ready for. And that could lead to a darker version of Mark over time. Not evil, but more ruthless, more willing to make hard calls, because he already crossed that line once, and crossing it again gets easier. And that's where this timeline gets interesting, because Mark defeating Omni-Man early might save lives in the short term, but it also risks pushing Mark closer to the very mindset Nolan had, valuing outcomes over people, efficiency over empathy. And if that happens, the line between hero and conqueror starts to blur. And that sets up a completely different long-term story, where the biggest threat to Earth isn't just the Viltrum Empire, but what Mark himself might become under constant pressure. Because power changes people. And Mark gaining that level of power and responsibility so early creates a version of him that's stronger, smarter, and more prepared, but also more isolated, more burdened, and more likely to make decisions that others won't understand. And in the end, Mark defeating Omni-Man in Season 1 doesn't just change who wins a fight, it rewrites the entire trajectory of the Invincible universe, accelerating conflicts, reshaping alliances, and forcing every character to adapt to a world where the strongest man on Earth fell sooner than expected, and his son took his place before he was ever ready for it.